The Joe Rogan Experience.
One of the big stories in it is how I then developed a relationship with my prosecutor, which I think you'll probably be in the camp of people of thinking that I'm utterly insane for having done that. Maybe you won't. I just remember that when we talked about this back in the day, you were like, this motherfucker.
Yeah. So you've become friends with him?
Friend is an interesting word. What is a friend? Someone else asked me that. Like, I was like, it depends on what you mean by friend. Because, and they said, well, do you trust him? And I said, well, I think that at the point that we are now in our relationship, I do trust him. I trust that he's telling me the truth about what he really thinks and feels about the situation. So I feel like I have very privileged special access to the mind of the person who put me in prison. And that is a very interesting, awkward, but also empowering place for me to be, because one of the things that really bothered me about this experience was not understanding why it happened to me. Why did this man look at a 20-year-old girl with no criminal history, no motivation to commit this crime? Why did he look at me and think, there's my rapist and murderer? And I didn't understand it. And I didn't feel like demonizing him in my mind or vilifying him in my mind was going to actually give me a satisfying answer as to the why of it all. A lot of people said, well, it's just because he's a bad dude. He doesn't care what the truth is. He's just covering his ass. Like, these were all really simplistic ways of framing his motivations, and I didn't really buy them. So instead, what I was interested in was going to the source and confronting him, asking why. But to ask someone, why did you hurt me, which I think is a really common thing that people who have been hurt want to know, is they want an acknowledgement that they've been hurt, and they want to understand why, and they want to know if that person's not going to hurt them anymore or not going to hurt other people. Like, that's really common for people who have been hurt. The challenge is that people who hurt other people don't like to be confronted with that fact. And so how do you start a conversation that's not going to immediately become adversarial? And that was one of my biggest challenges. But I came up with this methodology that I actually became so important to me that I tattooed it on my arm. So this is it. There are 4 steps. And the first one is find common ground. So it's this Venn diagram. Find common ground. I promise you that every single person on this earth, you have something in common with them. Find it. So I asked myself, what could I and my prosecutor have in common? I didn't know this man. I didn't know what his history was, what his background was. But I did know that he, like me, was part of this really big, scandalous in the media case. And he very likely felt misconstrued or misrepresented also in the process, maybe dehumanized in the process. And so I reached out to him and I acknowledged that fact. I said, hey, I don't know who you are. I only ever encountered you in the police office and in the courtroom, where you were someone who was trying to ruin my life. So you were a big, scary boogeyman. And I saw you in the media, and I've seen how the media represented you, but knowing from experience, I know how that can be very misrepresentative. So I said to him, I want to know who you really are. And I hope that you might be interested to know who I really am, because I don't think you know who I really am. I don't think that you would have prosecuted me if you knew who I really am. And that was the beginning of the dialogue. I went out of my way to acknowledge that he might have had noble motivations, even if he was wrong. And I think this is like a really important thing, is I wanted to give him radical benefit of the doubt. Maybe, just maybe, this like horrible thing that happened to me could have been the result of understandable mistakes And if anything, I think coming into contact with the innocence movement and criminal justice system stuff and reform, all the stuff that I've learned after having gone through this experience has made me realize that like some of the most horrible things can happen and can be enacted by people who have the best of intentions. And so I assumed that of him, and I gave him that benefit of the doubt. And as soon as I like opened that door, like, hey, you hurt me, but maybe that wasn't your intention. Maybe your intention was something else. He filled that void with his story and his message and what he wanted me to understand about himself. And I mean, one of the wildest things about this book is that I talk about, like, I do not sugarcoat what I went through, like, and especially what he did to me. Like, I very, like, clearly set out, like, here's the fucked up shit he said about me in court. Completely without evidence, like, totally made up bullshit. Like, and it ruined my life, right? Here's what it is. Acknowledge these facts. And also, here is a person who might have had, like, in doing so, might have been coming from a place of trying to rationalize things in his own mind, which is a thing that we all do. We all do on a regular basis. We're all just sort of interpreting our reality in the way that suits us. And so I wrote this book from my perspective. I translated the entire thing into Italian before it ever got published so that I could share it with him, so that he would know what I was saying about him in public, what was imminently going to come out. And his response was, I have never felt more seen. That's what he told me.
That sounds like something a teenage girl would say.
Well, that's an interesting observation. Because it's become quite emotional, especially on his part. I don't know. I shouldn't go there too much.
You're protecting his privacy? That's hilarious.
Yeah.
You're a very nice person. You're so much nicer than me.
Well, I don't know. I've just had really bad stuff happen to me. And like, I don't wish bad stuff upon other people. And
that's a beautiful way to live your life. It really is. I mean, that's what all Christians aspire to, is what you're doing.
Yeah, I guess I'm not a Christian.
Radical forgiveness.
Yeah. You know, and it's funny. I didn't really set out for, people like point to that. They're like, forgiveness, you're doing forgiveness. And I was like, is this forgiveness? Or is this...
Just communicating with him is forgiveness in some way and not having extreme anger.
Well, that's the thing. I do have extreme anger. Like, that's all part of it. And this is where, like, the Buddhist in me comes out, where you can have extreme anger towards a person and at the same time hold them in your hand as this, like, tender, fallible creature that is capable of violence against you, but is also capable of being hurt. Just because someone hurt you doesn't mean that they're not capable of being hurt. And I certainly don't want to be in the position of hurting someone. Like, that's just who I am. And if anything, like, one thing that I've communicated to him is like, look, I don't know if you're ever going to really wrap your head around what you did to me. But if you do one day, I know that you're going to feel really, really bad. And I just want you to know that I don't wish suffering on you. I don't. And that fascinates me. Like, in conversations with my prosecutor, how has he convinced himself that he's the good guy? And how has that changed when I have approached him not as an adversary, but as someone who is, I wouldn't say like tolerant, because I've never put myself in a position of sort of saying, oh, what you did was not a big deal. Like, when I approached him, I was like, what you did was a big deal and you were wrong and you hurt people. but like acknowledging his humanity and the complexity of him, and acknowledging that like he's not an evil person.
Well, what is evil? If you're
Intentional malice, maybe.
That seems like he was doing it intentionally. If he was paying attention to the facts of the case. I mean, there was DNA evidence. There was all sorts of stuff that pointed to you not being the guilty party, and they ignored that. If that's not evil.
I mean, what he did, it's interesting. He wrote a whole book about the case, and he talked about how when he first arrived at the scene, he immediately knew that it was a conspiracy, because he looked at the broken window, how the person had actually broken into our home, and said, there's no way, zero chance that a burglar would have broken into a house this way. He just was like 100% convinced that immediately that the break-in was staged. And if you take that, if you in your brain truly believe that, then what logically follows is a lot of what he then came up with. Well, someone in the house is trying to cover up for a crime that they were involved in. Who lives in that house? Well, there are 3 other girls, one of whom was in Rome, one of whom is another Italian girl who was with her boyfriend and friends, and one of whom is the American girl who was with her boyfriend that night, but who also happened to be the one who called the police and brought attention to the house. So maybe because we found her at the scene of the crime, like all of it sort of starts to like make logical sense if you begin with a false premise.
How did he reconcile that in the book?
In his book?
Yeah.
I mean,
because
he makes logical leaps. So he goes, okay, well, then we discovered that, all of this DNA of the person who actually committed the crime, right? Like, they finally get the DNA back, and it's all pointing to this guy who has a history of breaking and entering and aggression towards women. And he doesn't go, oh, no, we made a mistake. He goes, oh, how can now he be involved in this thing that I know Amanda's involved in, because I know the break-in was staged. And, so this is how a person with genuinely good intentions can have false beliefs that then from which one can logically derive an insane story that requires like him to now believe. Like, one of the things that I pointed out to him that just like drives me nuts, that he continues to like somehow hang on to, is this idea that I was in a threesome I was in a 3-way relationship with my actual boyfriend, Raffaele, and this burglar, Rudy Gaudet. And I was like, where are you coming up with that? And he was like, well, whenever I interviewed Rudy, like he talks about interrogating Rudy always seemed to have affectionate things to say about. He always seemed to like be interested in you. And from that, I can logically deduce that you guys had a relationship. And I was like, we like, I didn't even know his name. There's no record of us ever communicating with each other. No one ever like saw us hanging out with each other. Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, if he was involved in the crime and you're involved in the crime, and he's sort of talking about, you in an affectionate way, then logically it makes sense that you were in this, 3-way relationship with Raffaele and Rudy. And I'm like, that's not true. And he's like, well, that's what made logical sense to me at the time. And I
think the issue is an egotistic idiot that has power. That's really what I think it is.
It's certainly someone who has a belief and a confidence in their own abilities as a logical thinker. And I think anyone who is in that kind of position has to believe in themselves in that kind of way.
But not just that, like, you have too much power. Like,
fair.
There's not enough oversight. You have too much power. And then you say something, and if your initial assertion is incorrect, you then have to defend it. So then you do mental gymnastics to try to defend it.
Right.
At the expense of your fucking life.
Yes.
He was willing to put you away forever. Like, he had to know. At some point in time, in the back of his stupid brain, he had to know that you were innocent. And he was willing to push forward and concoct some sort of a 3-way relationship narrative that he still sticks to. Fuck that guy.
Well, and sometimes that's what my brain says. Sometimes
your brain should say that. Forgiveness is really important, but some people you just can't forgive. Like, some people, it's like, no, You need to come to grips with the fact that you're a piece of shit. That's what's wrong here.